My wife asked to dance with her lover at the couple's party, and I didn't hesitate. I looked her in the eye and said in a calm but firm voice, "You can, but come home alone." She froze. Neither the smiles around her nor the elegant music filling the room could disguise the weight of the silence that settled between us. She thought I would explode, that I would make a scene, that I would beg or argue, but what she received was the worst kind of response: the end. Simple, blunt, irreversible. When I rose from the table, my dignity went with me. I didn't need to scream, I didn't need to beg. She danced with him, but she danced with trembling hands, her eyes lost, as I walked away from what we once swore to protect together. And that was where our story ended, at least the one she knew. In the days that followed, she waited for my anger. She waited for the scandal, the fight, the long messages, the crying, the insistence. She received none of it. Instead, what she saw was the most piercing silence of her life. She stared at her phone as if gasping for oxygen. But all she found was the echo of the absence she herself chose. She discovered the hard way that her lover didn't want commitment, that his smiles died in superficiality, that the warmth of a fleeting touch would never compensate for the loss of a true home. And then, regret began to dig a void inside her that no embrace could fill. For years, I was the ground she walked on without fear. Her safety net. Her shoulder to lean on at the end of each difficult day. I was the certainty she carried, even on her darkest days. Until the day she chose the false glow of a new look, the momentary adrenaline of a forbidden exchange, the ego fueled by a desire that knew no depth. And me? I was left with the ashes of what I was, and with the obligation to rebuild every part of what she demolished without hesitation. She thought she'd have time. That betrayals like this are mended with regret. That time would forgive her and that the love I felt for her would be stronger than any hurt. But she didn't understand that betrayal doesn't just destroy trust, it slowly kills love. And when she finally reached out, all she found was air. I was long gone, even though my body was still in the same city. My heart. It was already somewhere else. Someone else. But the cruelest thing wasn't the betrayal itself. It was the way she believed she was in control. How she danced with him that night, certain she would have my devotion forever. How she looked at me before standing up, testing the limits, like someone challenging love to resist pain. And discovered too late that my love resisted everything, except contempt. After that night, she learned what true regret is. Not the kind that disappears with a conversation or an apology. But the regret that lives deep in the pit of your stomach, that consumes nights of sleep, that turns your pillow into a courtroom. She remembered my gestures. The way I held her hand at the movies. The coffee I'd leave ready before I left. My scent on the sheets. And when she tried to recreate that with someone else, everything was plastic. Empty. Temporary. She traded a story for a disposable plot. And only when she found herself alone, with a body by her side but no soul nearby, did she understand she had lost much more than a marriage. She had lost a man who loved her completely. But I didn't stay down. I picked up the pieces of what was left of me and went in search of something she could no longer give me, peace. I found eyes that looked at me without fear. A smile that didn't hide its intentions. A presence that filled me without demanding explanations. It was different. It was light. And, above all, it was true. I relearned to love without suspicion. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't have to fight to be a priority. I was. When she reached out to me, and yes, she did, I thought I'd feel anger. Or perhaps pleasure at her pain. But all I felt was peace. Her eyes red, her voice trembling, she said she regretted it, that she loved me, that she missed me. And me? I said I forgive her. Not to return, but to move on lightly. Because forgiveness isn't a key that reopens doors, it's a polite end. I offered what was left of us, the memory. And I made it clear that love, when it dies like this, doesn't come back. She was left with the absence she caused. And I, with the peace I rebuilt. But what she never imagined, what she never foresaw, was the moment when emptiness turned to despair. When he tried to reconnect, he realized I was already out of reach. He tried to relive the smiles, the places, the songs, but everything had changed meaning. That house, once full of life, was now just an echo. Her lover. He had disappeared as quickly as he had arrived. And there, within the walls of what was left, she began to understand the value of things that never return. Of choices that never get a second chance. She thought she could experience something new. But all she found was a bitter reflection of herself. Because when you choose emptiness, that's what you live with. The party ended, the dancing ended, and in the end, all that was left was the music playing to no one. But what happened to her after that? How does someone learn to live with the absence of everything they destroyed with their own hands? And how much does the price of a bad choice go, when the love lost is the very one they will seek forever? Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not romanticize and never support any type of betrayal. The stories you will hear are fictional, but the feelings, pain, and consequences are inspired by real life. Our purpose is clear, to show how betrayal destroys, corrodes, and changes destinies forever. Get ready now for a shocking story, intense and unforgettable. Press play, and feel what it means firsthand: lose everything because of a wrong choice. Her name was Elena, his was Daniel. A couple who, at first glance, seemed to have been patiently crafted by life. They met on an ordinary afternoon, but the way their eyes met for the first time made it seem as if the world around them slowed down just to allow that moment to last longer. Elena, with her calm posture, restrained smile, and sweet way of listening even in silence, was the kind of woman who drew attention not only for her evident beauty, but for the peace she carried in her gaze. Daniel was the balance between reason and sensitivity. He had a firm presence, but a heart that beat intensely for everything that was part of his life, and Elena, from the beginning, became the center of that universe. They met through mutual friends, at a small weekend celebration, the kind no one really plans, but which inexplicably stays etched in the memory. There were no promises made at that first meeting, no rehearsed phrases, no exaggerated gestures. Just a conversation that lasted hours, spontaneous laughter, a shared coffee at the end of the night, and a message the next day that said, "I want to see you again." And so it all began. Naturally, truthfully, with a lightness that only the most sincere beginnings can offer. Their relationship grew slowly, unhurriedly, with roots planted in deep conversations, lingering glances, and comfortable silences. There was a rare complicity, a desire to be together that needed no justification. When Daniel looked at Elena, he saw a future. Not a grand or ostentatious future, but one of those simple and genuine ones, made of breakfasts together, walks hand in hand, and a home where they could both be themselves, without masks. Elena, in turn, saw Daniel as a haven. He was the kind of man who, even in silence, exuded security. He never needed to raise his voice to be respected, never needed to prove anything to anyone. The way he treated others, the way he looked at her, the way he listened attentively to every detail of her day, showed he was different. They lived in a quiet neighborhood, where mornings were filled with the sound of children heading to school and the smell of fresh bread wafting from the bakeries. Their home was simple but vibrant. There were photos on the walls, books shared between them, and small details that told the couple's story: a blanket draped over the sofa that Elena loved to use on cold days, a plant on the porch that Daniel watered religiously every morning, the collection of mugs they bought on every trip they took together, even if it was just a weekend getaway to a nearby town. As the years passed, life settled down. Responsibilities, bills, and difficult decisions arose. But even in the most tense moments, there was respect. Daniel always made a point of keeping Sundays to themselves, without cell phones or distractions. He would make coffee while Elena read on the couch, then they would sit on the porch and talk about everything and nothing. They talked about life, plans, movies, childhood memories. It was in these moments that Elena felt most strongly that she had made the right choice. And Daniel, though he didn't always say it with words, showed with gestures that he loved every detail of their routine with her. Friends saw them as a model couple. Not because of their ideal of perfection, but because of the way they weathered the ups and downs together. They knew how to laugh at each other, apologize when necessary, and compromise without losing their essence. They were far from perfect, but their imperfections seemed to have found a rare balance. Elena worked in early childhood education and brought home the sweetness and patience she developed with children. She had a strong emotional connection with what she did, and Daniel admired that about her. He sometimes said she lit up the room when she talked about her work, and she smiled as if receiving a meaningful compliment. Daniel, on the other hand, worked in design, and although he spent much of his time immersed in projects and deadlines, he always made time for Elena. He made a point of being present, even on the most tiring days. When he knew she would be late, he would leave loving notes scattered around the house or a hot meal waiting on the stove. She, in turn, knew exactly the kind of music he liked to relax after a hard day, and sometimes she would wait for him with the perfect track playing on the record player while she made a glass of wine. But like any couple who's been together for years, there were also longer silences, days of unwarranted irritation, small accusations that accumulated under the rug. They didn't fight often, but when they did, it took them a while to reconnect. Daniel was more introspective, preferring to reflect in silence. Elena, though communicative, sometimes withdrew as well, waiting for him to take the initiative and break the ice. Still, they knew how to find their way back to each other. They knew how to forgive each other, and perhaps that's why their relationship lasted so long. Anniversaries always held a special meaning. Every wedding anniversary was celebrated with a unique dinner, or a simple yet meaningful trip. They kept a box filled with old letters, handwritten notes, movie tickets, and plane tickets. Elena, especially, treasured these tangible memories. And Daniel, despite his objectivity, treasured them all. They both knew that love also lives in the details. During their time together, they also forged bonds with each other's families. Elena's parents treated Daniel like a son, and his brothers considered Elena a little sister. At Sunday lunches and holiday parties, they were always together, like a natural extension of each other. And that was something that strengthened them. The sense of belonging. The idea that, even in difficult times, they had a solid foundation to fall back on. In recent months, some changes began to emerge, but nothing out of the ordinary. Daniel had been dedicating himself to an important project, which left him a little more absent during the week. Elena, for her part, began participating in social activities more frequently, getting involved in school projects, and going out with colleagues after work. But the two still found time for each other, albeit less intensely. When they did manage to sit at the table, conversation still flowed, though sometimes one or the other seemed a little tired. It was as if life was simply adjusting its routines, adapting the relationship to the new phase. Some nights, Daniel would wake up and miss Elena beside him in bed. She'd say she'd gone to read in the living room, or that she'd had insomnia. He believed her. There was no reason not to. They had built something based on trust, and Daniel wasn't the type to suspect without reason. He preferred the benefit of the doubt. And Elena, with her serene expression and coherent answers, left no room for suspicion. She still kissed him before leaving, still hugged him when they saw him again, still told him she loved him. And Daniel still loved her back, still felt it, still believed. Their closest friends continued to see them as the stable couple they'd always been. And indeed, the two still conveyed that image of harmony, of deep connection, of two who understood each other with a glance. It was hard to imagine that anything could shake that. It was hard to believe that a love built with such care could wear thin or be set aside. After all, everything still seemed in place. The photos on the walls, the everyday gestures, the future plans. But what it seems isn't always what it is. And behind the smiles exchanged in public, the vows whispered in the dark, and the hands clasped in the presence of others, an invisible crack slowly began to appear. A small, silent crack, imperceptible to the inattentive eye, but which, in time, would become large enough to swallow everything they had built. Over the past few weeks, something had begun to quietly shift in Elena and Daniel's routine. It was hard to pinpoint the exact moment when everything began to slip through their fingers, like sand slowly moving until it disappeared unnoticed. There was, indeed, affection in the gestures, but the time that had once been sacred was now divided by increasingly frequent distractions. The conversations at the table became shorter, the touches quicker, and the smiles, these began to carry something strange, almost like a mask of normalcy that the two struggled to maintain. Daniel still had his attentive gaze, but now there was a silent question in his eyes, a doubt that settled like a shadow in the corners of the house. Elena, for her part, was more absent, yet present. Her body walked beside Daniel, but her thoughts always seemed elsewhere, as if she lived in two parallel worlds, one beside her husband, and another he hadn't yet recognized. She started going out more often, claiming to be meeting up with classmates from the school where she worked, meetings outside of normal hours, extended lunches. There was no lie in her words, but there was an absence in her eyes. And Daniel, though he tried to ignore it, noticed. He began to notice her schedules, the way she dressed for outings, her attention to detail, her different perfumes. Sometimes she took longer than usual to respond to messages. When she returned, she spoke cheerfully, but her excitement sounded artificial, as if she were trying to prove something she herself didn't feel so certain about. He began to remember the moments of strangeness like someone putting together loose pieces of a puzzle that he doesn't yet know what will reveal. They weren't proof. They were feelings. Intuitions. The nights became quieter. Daniel tried to create moments for themselves, but Elena always seemed busy or tired. She started going to bed earlier or said she had a headache. He subtly insisted, offering tea, asking if she wanted to talk, but she said everything was fine. Always that phrase. Everything was fine. And he, out of respect, out of love, believed her. Or at least, tried to believe her. But there was something more. There was the weight of an unjustified distance, and the feeling that the house, once a home, was becoming just a dwelling. The objects were in place, the routines were still followed, but the soul, it seemed to slowly escape through some crack he couldn't find. Elena also felt the weight of what she was doing, but hid it well. She justified it to herself by saying she was simply experiencing a moment of confusion, of rediscovery, of a need to feel alive. In truth, what she was experiencing was an internal contradiction that tore at her silently. She knew the value of the man she was married to. She knew Daniel's heart, knew his dedication, his fidelity. But at the same time, she had let someone into her life who awakened in her an old excitement, an adrenaline rush she hadn't felt in years. It was new, it was dangerous, it was forbidden, and that made it seem more intense than it really was. The other man, with his confident manner and steady gaze, said everything she wanted to hear in that moment of doubt. He made her feel desired, unique, the center of attention she believed she had lost at home. But it was an unbalanced game. Because deep down, she knew that what she felt for Daniel was real love, built, tested. And what she felt for the other, was an illusion. The encounters with her lover began as coincidences, then as curiosity, and soon became an addiction. Elena began to play two characters. During the day, she was the devoted wife, the woman who chatted with his parents, who smiled at Sunday lunches, who took care of the house as if she were still the center of everything. But as soon as Daniel left, as soon as a break in her routine was enough, she transformed. She hurriedly grabbed her cell phone, arranged secret meetings, made up plans. In the mirror, she touched up her makeup with the same hand that would later touch the face of a man who wasn't her husband. And every time she walked back through the door, she carried a weight on her shoulders that became unbearable. The worst part was that Daniel didn't accuse her. He didn't fight, he didn't openly suspect. He continued to be kind. He continued to make coffee. He continued to try. And that made her feel even worse. Because the more he showed love, the deeper she sank into guilt. And the more guilt, the more she clung to the lie to avoid facing the reality of what she was doing. She began to avoid looking him in the eye. He began to hold her less firmly. He began to evade simple questions. She no longer talked about her day, didn't share details, didn't make future plans. But Daniel still didn't confront her. He waited. He watched. He analyzed. And it was on one particular night, during a casual dinner with friendly couples, that the tension reached an almost unbearable point. Elena seemed restless, her gaze wandering, her fingers fidgeting with her napkin. Daniel, on the other hand, watched silently, with an expression that mixed sadness and acceptance. During a conversation about relationships, one of the friends commented that trust is the cornerstone of any marriage. Elena looked away immediately. Daniel simply took a deep breath and took a sip of wine, as if he had swallowed a piece of his own dignity. That night, when they arrived home, Elena went to her room without saying much. Daniel remained in the living room for a while, sitting, staring at a fixed point. The silence was so thick it seemed to fill every space. When he finally lay down beside her, he realized Elena was already asleep, or pretending to be. Turned away, distant. He didn't touch her. He just lay there, eyes open, listening to the sound of his own breathing and trying to remember the last time he felt they were truly together. The following days were filled with growing tension. Daniel became quieter, more reserved. Elena understood, but didn't comment. They were trapped in a bubble where words no longer reached what needed to be said. And it was in this empty space that an invitation arrived, a couple's party, organized by mutual friends. A tradition they'd followed for years. Daniel hesitated, but Elena insisted. She wanted to keep up appearances. She wanted, somehow, to convince herself that she could still pretend everything was under control. When the day arrived, they got ready in silence. Daniel put on his best suit. Elena chose a dress he always complimented, but this time there was no comment. Just a brief glance and a nod. During the journey, they exchanged few words. They arrived together, smiled at their friends, and greeted them warmly. But Elena's eyes were looking elsewhere. And Daniel noticed. The music started, the couples danced. The mood was light, relaxed. But something in the air seemed dense to them. At one point, Elena stepped away for a few minutes. She went to the bathroom, she said. But Daniel knew. There was no expression more painful than his at that moment. When she returned, she fixed her hair, ran her fingers over her lips, and walked toward him with an undefined expression. And then, with the naturalness of someone asking for a trivial favor, she said she wanted to dance with another man, one of the guests, an old acquaintance. Daniel looked her in the eye. He didn't ask who. He didn't want to know. He simply replied, "You can, but go home alone." She froze. And in the next instant, Daniel rose from his chair with the calm of someone who understands there's nothing more to say. He walked toward the exit, without raising his voice, without looking back. And with him, the last vestige of the story they had built disappeared. But what Elena didn't know yet was that betrayal wasn't the end of the pain. It was just the beginning. Elena spent the first 2 days after the party without much sleep. She paced the house like an uncomfortable visitor, avoiding the rooms that once represented affection, now devoid of meaning. The walls, once complicit in their daily routine, seemed to listen to her every step with judgment. She tried to write a message to Daniel, but no words seemed enough. She erased, rewrote, erased again. Nothing would make sense after that night. The image of him walking away with his firm posture, his calm voice, and his determined gaze followed her like a specter. She thought that, perhaps, with a few days of separation, he would calm down. That the pain would give way to longing. But none of that happened. Silence was the only answer. And it was precisely this silence that hurt her the most. He didn't seek, didn't ask, didn't try to understand. He simply disappeared from the narrative of the life she believed could still be salvaged. It wasn't until the 5th day that she summoned the courage to go to her old apartment. She had some excuse, to return a box of documents, to ask about a joint account, any excuse to justify her presence. He knocked twice. No answer. He knocked a 3rd time. A neighbor down the hall told her he was no longer there. He'd left 2 days earlier with some bags, without saying where he was going. Elena thanked him briefly and walked downstairs, her chest heavy. It was at that moment that she realized the goodbye had already happened, and that she'd lost her chance for an explanation. In the following weeks, she tried to resume her life as if everything were on hold. But it wasn't. The pain was active, present, growing. Her lover disappeared soon after the party. He said what they had experienced was light, fleeting, that he didn't want any trouble. "I don't get involved with women who still have unresolved feelings," he said before simply leaving her there, awash in regret and shame. Elena was left alone, the weight of her own choice pressing against her chest like an anchor. She didn't know where Daniel was, she didn't know how she was. But she knew that, somewhere, he had finally freed himself from her. It was 3 months later that the unexpected happened. Elena was walking through a park near the old cafe where they used to go when she saw him. He was sitting with his back to her, wearing a shirt she knew well, a book in his hands, and a slight smile on his face. Beside him was a woman. Her hair tied up casually, her eyes laughing easily, a serene presence. The two of them talked as if the world around them didn't exist. Elena froze. Her legs trembled. It wasn't jealousy. It was grief. Grief for something she herself had killed. Daniel didn't see her. And she didn't have the courage to approach. She just stood there, watching for a few minutes, until she realized he was okay. Truly okay. It wasn't a facade. The sparkle in his eyes was different. He wasn't the same man she'd left at the couple's party. He had rebuilt himself. The pain grew sharp, but she swallowed it. She returned home and cried uncontrollably for the first time. Not because of what he was going through now. But because she was the one who gave it all up. Because she had given the love of her life to another woman, not because he had been taken from her. She decided she needed to talk to him. Even if it was just to apologize. Even if it was just to hear that he never wanted to see her again. She needed to tell him, even just once, that what she felt was real. That the mistake was hers, but the love hadn't gone away. She found a new number and called. His voice answered calmly. And upon hearing that hello, she took a deep breath and blurted out a plea she'd been holding back for weeks. She wanted to talk. Just talk. Daniel agreed. They arranged to meet at a neutral cafe. She arrived first, her hands cold, her heart racing. When he entered, he sat down calmly. He was different. Not just in his face, but in his posture. He was no longer the man she'd known. He was someone more whole. Someone reborn from pain. She began by saying she didn't want to disrupt his new life, that she didn't expect to get back together, but she needed, somehow, to apologize while looking him in the eye. She said she didn't know what she was looking for when she left the marriage, that she lost herself in needs, in selfish desires, and that she paid for it with the weight of regret. That his silence was what hurt the most, because it confirmed that he no longer saw her the same way. He listened to her without interrupting, without looking away. And when she finished, he responded calmly. He said he forgave her. Not to get back together, but to stop carrying the hurt. He said he understood that sometimes love doesn't die from a lack of feeling, but from a lack of care. And that what was between them, though it had been real, was destroyed not by one night, but by a series of decisions she made alone. Elena nodded with tears in her eyes, saying she understood. But she couldn't hide her pain. It was then, in the silence that followed, that she asked, without thinking, almost on impulse, if he had fallen in love again. And the answer was a slight smile followed by a yes. He said he'd met someone who made him feel at peace. And that this peace was something he hadn't known he needed until he lost it to her. Elena swallowed. She tried to smile. She said she was happy for him. But her eyes didn't hide it. As they stood to leave, she thanked him for the conversation. For listening. For the forgiveness. And turned to go. But it was then that Daniel called her name, as he hadn't done in a long time. She turned. And he, with firm eyes, told her he needed to be honest. That there was something she didn't know. Something he'd kept hidden out of respect for their history, but now saw no reason to hide. Elena frowned. He sighed deeply, reached into his pocket, and pulled out a crumpled envelope. It was a letter. Folded in half. She picked it up with trembling hands and immediately recognized her own handwriting. It was an old letter. Very old. She had written it during a time of crisis between them, years ago, when she thought it might be best to part ways. She had never had the courage to give it to him. She had thrown it away, or so she thought. But Daniel had it. He said he found the letter months before the betrayal, in an old notebook. That he read it all. Every word. Every doubt. Every resentment. And that from that day on, he understood that their relationship had been unbalanced for longer than he'd imagined. He said he realized she was distancing herself long before any lover. That there was a longing within her that he could never fill. And that's why, when he saw the betrayal materialize, he wasn't shocked. He felt only confirmation. He said that night at the party, when he left her, it wasn't the betrayal that hurt. It was the realization that she hadn't loved him for a long time. And that he, out of stubbornness, pretended not to see it. Elena broke down right there. Not because of the secret of the letter. But because she realized he was gone before he even walked out the door. That she lost the man who loved her long before she danced with someone else. That the true abandonment wasn't his, it was hers, and it began well before any physical betrayal. Daniel hugged her one last time. Without desire. Without anger. Without hurt. Only compassion. Then he turned and walked away. And in that moment, she knew, the love she had destroyed was already dead, buried in the silence of a letter she had written herself, which, ironically, revealed everything he needed to know to stop trying. And that's when she understood. That the real punishment wasn't losing him. It was living with the knowledge that the one who loved her completely left with only half of what he deserved, while she was left with the emptiness she'd built word by word, omission by omission, silence by silence. That afternoon, after the conversation at the cafe and the revelation of the forgotten letter, Elena returned home feeling as if she were walking through rubble. Nothing remained of the emotional home she had shared with Daniel. His words had been sharpened not by their tone, but by their precision. Each sentence carried not aggression, but the weight of a truth she had tried to avoid for too long. The letter, forgotten for years, was the cruelest symbol of what they had become even before the betrayal. What hurt most was not forgiveness, nor the love that was gone. It was knowing that she herself had initiated the silent unraveling of the relationship she claimed to cherish so much. In the following days, Elena tried to return to her routine, but everything seemed out of place. The places she frequented, the conversations with colleagues, even the mirror no longer recognized her. She was pale, her eyes dull, her breathing shallow, and a constant anxiety in her chest that turned minutes into hours. The nights were long and cold. She began to dream about the past more often, reliving scenes that previously seemed unimportant, a loving look in the middle of an argument, a shared laugh on a rainy Monday, a simple touch of hands in the supermarket line. These small moments, previously unnoticed, now returned like stabs, proving that true love never needed spectacle to exist. And that it was precisely in the lack of attention to detail that she began to lose it. The following week, while trying to reorganize old documents tucked away in the back of a drawer, she found a photo album they had put together during their second year of marriage. She sat on the floor and leafed through it slowly, as if touching open wounds. Each page held not just images, but dormant memories. Simple trips, birthday parties, impromptu dinners. There was a genuine, almost naive happiness there that now seemed too distant to touch. And it was then that she realized something she hadn't accepted before: the betrayal wasn't the beginning of the end. It was the consequence of a series of subtle abandonments on her part and his, albeit to varying degrees. Neither of them had the courage to admit they were losing each other, and by the time they realized it, it was too late. A few days later, she decided to write to him. Not with the intention of getting closer, but to release the words that were suffocating her. A short, direct letter, in which she thanked him for being who he was, for having loved as he had, and, above all, for having had the greatness to forgive. She didn't expect a reply. She didn't want any more answers. She simply wanted to end the pain that insisted on remaining trapped inside her. He sent the letter, and for the first time in weeks, she slept without dreams. It was as if he had finally accepted that the chapter was closed, even if the ending had been written by different hands than those who had begun the story. Meanwhile, Daniel continued his life with firm steps. He had someone by his side who didn't carry ghosts, who didn't demand constant confirmation, who didn't make him feel inadequate. The new woman who was now part of his days had the gift of calm silence, sincere gestures, and a light presence. She didn't compete with her past, she didn't want to compare herself to Elena. She was simply herself, whole, transparent, and that was enough. Daniel, for his part, didn't speak ill of his ex-wife, didn't harbor grudges, or relive hurt feelings. For him, the pain of betrayal had been real, but it no longer took up space. What remained was the learning, and he accepted that with respect. But fate sometimes demands encounters that don't ask permission. At a charity event at the school where Elena still worked, Daniel showed up without knowing she would be there. He had been invited by his new partner, who supported social causes and had been asked to give a short talk. When Elena saw him beside her, in the middle of the room decorated with colorful balloons and posters handmade by the children, her heart stopped for a second. Not because she still loved him the same way, but because she realized, clearly, that he now belonged to another universe. A universe in which she no longer had a place. During the evening, they met eyes only once. She smiled briefly, and he returned it with a polite nod. No words. No tension. Just two worlds that no longer touched. Daniel's new partner approached Elena later, unaware of her, and praised the event's organization. Their conversation lasted only a few minutes, but enough for Elena to see in her eyes what she'd seen in her own years before: trust, admiration, respect. And it was then that she understood, once again, that she had lost much more than a man. She had lost the reflection of the best of herself that he had always seen in her, and that she, through insecurity or neglect, had failed to maintain. That same night, when he got home, he sat on the porch for hours, watching the overcast sky. He remembered when they'd done this together, saying nothing, just sharing the comfortable silence. He didn't cry. There were no tears anymore. Just a deep weariness, an emotional exhaustion that seemed impossible to heal. He picked up his phone and opened a note where he'd written things he'd wanted to say, but hadn't. He read them quietly, as if speaking to someone still there. When he finished, he deleted everything. He didn't need to carry them around anymore. Days later, she was surprised by an unexpected message from Daniel's new partner. She had discovered who Elena was. Not out of jealousy or distrust, but because she wanted to understand a little more about the man who was now part of her life. In the message, he said he had no intention of invading anyone's past, but wanted to thank her. Because, despite everything, if that story hadn't ended, she would never have met Daniel. Elena, reading it, felt something inexplicable. A mixture of pain and relief. It hurt because the message confirmed that someone else was occupying the space that was once hers. But it relieved her because, finally, she understood that the cycle had ended. Not with anger, not with shouting, but with an acceptance that only time can build. At the end of that month, Elena transferred to another school, in another city. She needed distance. Not to escape, but to begin. She took a few things with her, among them an old photo of her and Daniel on a simple autumn trip. She didn't take it out of nostalgia. She took it as a reminder of who she once was, and of who she could still be, if she had the courage to start over. She began to live more quietly, more introspectively. She learned to walk alone, to organize the house just for herself, to cook slowly, to not depend on messages to feel alive. A year passed. Daniel moved on with his life serenely, and Elena gradually found a new kind of peace. She no longer sought justification for what she'd experienced. She no longer harbored the what-ifs. He learned to look back with humility and move forward with ease. I still remembered him, but now without the pain. I remembered him as one remembers a story that was real, intense, and fulfilled its purpose. And perhaps, deep down, that was exactly what love needed, to be remembered with gratitude, even if it ended with a goodbye. But what no one saw was the exact moment when Elena, one random early morning, finally understood everything. It wasn't a cinematic epiphany, nor a dramatic revelation. It was just a silent thought, as she rinsed a cup of tea in the sink. She smiled to herself and whispered to herself, I was the mistake he had the courage to leave behind. There was no sadness in that sentence. There was truth. And with it, the liberation she had sought for so long. The next morning, he opened the windows, let the sun shine in, and went for a walk. For the first time in a long time, he felt light. Not because he'd forgotten. But because, finally, he'd accepted. And amid the anonymous crowd of that new city, Elena began to write her own story, one that no longer depended on repairing the rubble of the past, but on building, brick by brick, a present worthy of the future she still had. Moving to another city brought Elena not only the fresh start she so desperately needed, but also the inevitable confrontation with who she had become. There, far from everything she knew, her most vivid memories, her familiar faces, and the places marked by Daniel's constant presence, she was forced to find herself alone, without any reflection from her surroundings to confirm her. For the first few months, she lived on autopilot. She would wake up early, organize her materials for class, walk to the school where she now taught a class of children who knew nothing of her past, and at night she would return to a small rented apartment that still smelled new, as if not even time wanted to enter it. There was no laughter, no portraits on the walls, no traces of another life. Only the sound of her own breathing filling the void. She learned to cook for herself, to sit on the porch with a glass of wine and listen to her loneliness as if it were an old friend she'd finally found the courage to face. There was a strange peace in no longer having to explain anything, in no longer justifying her mistakes to anyone, in knowing that from then on, any pain she felt would be her own responsibility. The early mornings were still long, but they began to hurt less. She rediscovered small, forgotten pleasures, writing, listening to old songs, walking aimlessly. She wasn't looking to fill the void, just learning to live with it, like someone who accepts the scar as part of their body. One night, when he received an invitation for a casual get-together with some classmates from his new school, he hesitated for several minutes before accepting. I didn't want to repeat mistakes, I didn't want to start over from distractions. But he went, without expectations. During the conversation in the restaurant, surrounded by soft voices and unfamiliar gazes, she realized she could laugh again. A shy, restrained, but sincere laugh. It was as if a part of her was emerging after a long submerged time. One of her classmates, a calm and observant man named Miguel, began to strike up a conversation with her spontaneously, without any apparent ulterior motives. They talked about books, movies, stories from class. And for the first time in a long time, Elena didn't feel the need to feign enthusiasm. The conversation flowed naturally, without the weight of the past, without pressure, without the need to prove anything. In the days that followed, they began to have informal lunches together. They walked the streets after work, exchanged messages at night. Miguel was different. He didn't seek to invade or fill gaps. He simply offered his presence. Elena, though still wary, began to allow his company to become a constant. There was no immediate passion, no euphoria. It was something calmer, more mature, more aware. She was no longer the same woman she'd been before, and perhaps because of that, she was learning to love differently. On the other side of life, Daniel continued to consolidate his new relationship. With the woman who now accompanied him, he found a kind of balance he never imagined existed. It was a relationship built on frank dialogue, mutual respect, and the daily choice to stay. There was no fear of abandonment, nor the feeling of always fighting to keep something going. With her, he learned that love isn't a constant struggle, but rather a refuge. They shared simple dreams, viable plans, small gestures that made sense. The pain of the past didn't disappear completely, but it was reduced to silent memories, now serving only as a reminder of what he would never accept again. A dilemma arose for Elena one afternoon while organizing school activities. Miguel invited her for a weekend in another city, nothing romantic, just a light trip, an attempt to escape the routine. She smiled, but inside her chest tightened. She knew he liked her. And she also knew she was beginning to feel something similar. But she also carried the fear of repeating mistakes. She didn't want Miguel to be a substitute, a distraction, or a relief from guilt. She wanted to approach him honestly, with a clean heart. And there, faced with the choice of accepting the invitation or backing away, she understood the true weight of the betrayal she once committed. It wasn't just Daniel who lost trust in love. She did too. The mistake she made taught her, brutally, that the destruction of a bond doesn't just affect the other. It affects, first, the betrayer. Because the moment that line is crossed, an essential part of who one is broken, and the process of rebuilding will never be complete. Elena declined the invitation but explained her reasons. She told Miguel she needed more time, that she was trying to relearn how to feel. He understood. And he stayed by her side, respecting the time, respecting the silences. For her, that was valuable proof that there were still people willing to love without rushing. They began to see each other more often, now without pressure, without labels, without urgency. Little by little, she began to allow herself. A dinner here, a movie there, an exchange of confidences about the wounds they carried. Their intimacy grew like a tree that stands tall even after a great storm, firmer, more aware, more resilient. Meanwhile, Daniel received an unexpected letter in the mail one day. It was from Elena. Not an attempt to return, not an apology. Just a sincere letter, telling her that she was learning to live again, that she had finally understood the extent of the harm she had caused, that she had rediscovered her own name in another's voice, and that she now understood that love, when it is real, cannot tolerate the absence of truth. The last line simply said, "Thank you for letting me go, even when I didn't know what I would lose by doing so." Daniel read the letter silently. He folded it carefully and put it in a box filled with nothing but small pieces of the past he didn't want to forget, but also no longer needed to revisit. He understood that Elena had found something precious, genuine repentance and growth. And that was enough. He didn't need reunions, reconciliations, or poetic endings. The truth had already been told. The story had ended with dignity, and that was enough. That same night, Elena walked alone to the city's viewpoint, a place she had discovered weeks before and now used as a place of reflection. She watched the lights come on in the distance, felt the light wind on her face, and thought about the journey she had made. She didn't feel victorious, nor healed. But I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, peace. Not the peace of someone who has erased the past, but the peace of someone who has learned to live with it. I knew there would still be days of doubt, of insecurity, of uncomfortable memories. But she also knew she was capable of facing them without running away, without lying to herself. When she returned home, she found a message from Miguel, "I thought of you today while reading a book. I think that's a good sign." She smiled. She didn't respond right away. She sat on the sofa, hugged her knees, and let that simple gesture wash over her. She was ready to live again. Not out of impulse, not out of necessity, but because now, finally, she knew who she was, and who she never wanted to be again. And it was at this precise point, between acceptance and a new beginning, that the story began to prepare for the ending it always deserved. An ending that wouldn't bring any miraculous twists or forced redemptions. But an ending built on truth, pain, growth, and, above all, the awareness that certain loves, however beautiful they may have been, only exist to teach us what should never be lost again. At school, as the hallways filled with children's voices and colorful drawings on the walls, Elena began to experience a new kind of presence. Her posture was no longer fraught with hesitation, that of a woman trying not to be seen for fear of being remembered. Little by little, she relearned to occupy spaces more naturally, without the silent guilt that had suffocated her for so long. Miguel remained close by, his presence constant and serene, but never invasive. The two shared their daily lives with ease, and even without yet naming what they were building, it was clear that a path was being forged together, with patient steps. One random Saturday, he invited her to visit an art studio in a neighboring town. Elena accepted, not with her usual trepidation, but with curiosity and, perhaps, even the beginnings of a desire to see the world through different eyes. During the drive, the road was lined with dry trees, and the wind made the leaves flutter lightly. In the car, the silence between them was comfortable, almost necessary. When they arrived, they walked together among sculptures and canvases painted with raw emotion, art that seemed to scream feelings that words often couldn't convey. Elena stopped before a painting depicting two bodies intertwined, but disconnected by their eyes, looking in opposite directions, yet embraced. She stood there for long minutes. Miguel, approaching, didn't say anything. He simply gently touched her hand. She squeezed back. That was enough. After that day, the two met more often, and a new phase of their story began to emerge, now without comparisons, without fear of repetition, without Daniel's shadow looming between them. Even so, at night, every now and then, the past would knock on the door with an uncomfortable gentleness. It was no longer guilt, nor longing. It was memory. Elena remembered Daniel not as a desire to be recaptured, but as a part of who she was. It no longer hurt the same way, but it left its mark. And it was on one of those nights, organizing old folders of lesson plans, that he found a letter he'd never seen before. It was folded among papers from an old teaching training course he'd completed years ago. Upon opening it, he immediately recognized Daniel's handwriting. The letter was undated, but its intent was clear. He'd written it as if it were a confession to himself, and for some reason, perhaps distraction, perhaps choice, the letter had ended up forgotten there. In the letter, Daniel spoke of his failed attempt to keep alive a relationship that was no longer mutual. He recounted how, on several occasions, he felt like he was speaking to someone who had already departed, even though their body was still present. He spoke of nights when she slept beside him without even noticing that he hadn't fallen asleep, and of mornings when he made coffee even though he wasn't sure if she would drink it. And then, in the final passage, he wrote that his greatest fear wasn't being betrayed, but discovering that he had become invisible to someone who had once been able to see him completely. Elena reread the letter 3 times. The words seemed to scream, echo, and get stuck in her throat. There was no anger there, only exhaustion. A silent exhaustion that only those who love alone can bear. He kept the letter, but not in a drawer. He placed it in a small frame and left it on the bedroom table, not as a form of self-punishment, but as a symbol of who she never wanted to be again. A few weeks later, on a calm autumn morning, she found Miguel sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee, his expression more serious than usual. As she sat beside him, she knew something different was about to be said. Miguel spoke about a job offer in another city, many hours away. An environmental education project that would require full-time dedication for at least 2 years. He said he didn't expect her to accompany him, but he also didn't want to leave without being honest about how he felt. Elena listened silently. And for the first time in her life, she didn't react with despair at the possibility of losing someone. She looked at him calmly, smiled slightly, and said that if it was his dream, he should go. The dreams that move us shouldn't be interrupted. And what is true always finds a way to continue, even from a distance. Miguel left 2 weeks later, and the two remained in touch, with frequent video calls, sincere messages, and routine sharing. There were no promises, no forced plans. Just a real connection, maintained by two people who respected each other enough not to imprison the other. Elena, instead of withdrawing into sadness, decided to dedicate herself more to her personal projects. She started a postgraduate degree, set up a small book club for her students' mothers, and began writing regularly on a blog where she discussed emotional reconstruction, identity, and choices. Her writing gained a loyal readership, and little by little, she began to be sought out by women also trying to find themselves after painful experiences. In one of these messages, a woman spoke about the end of a marriage after a betrayal she herself had committed, and how guilt prevented her from moving on. Elena responded with a sincere text, in which she didn't try to justify mistakes, but rather showed that it's possible to navigate pain honestly, taking responsibility, and choosing to grow rather than run away. This exchange of words sparked an idea in Elena that had been brewing for some time: writing a book. Not about her story, exactly, but about what she had learned from it. Writing took over her days. She spent entire nights revising chapters, creating characters, aligning ideas. The process was cathartic. Each written word was a layer of pain being peeled back, a truth being reinterpreted. Meanwhile, Daniel continued his life discreetly. He knew from a mutual friend that Elena was fine. Hearing this brought him peace, but he didn't seek further information. He was happy in his new life, and there was no longer any room for resentment or nostalgia. One afternoon, however, he received a package. Inside was a copy of Elena's recently published book, with a handwritten dedication, "To the one who taught me, even without knowing it, that absence can be the deepest form of love. That silence is sometimes the greatest cry for dignity. And that not every ending is failure, sometimes, it's just the beginning of something truer." Daniel read the words with respect. He leafed through the book, read a few excerpts, and then carefully put it back on the shelf. He felt no desire to write back, nor to reconnect. But he felt pride. Because, despite everything, there was something beautiful in seeing the woman he once loved transforming pain into something useful, sincere, and sensitive. Months passed, and Miguel returned to the city for a brief visit. The two met in the same park where they used to walk at the beginning of it all. When they saw each other, there was no tension, no doubt, no anguish. Just calm smiles, long hugs, and the certainty that there was something real there. They walked side by side, and Miguel talked about his projects, his difficulties, his longing. Elena talked about the book, the women she met through it, and the new meaning the word "starting over" had taken on. Late that afternoon, they sat on a bench beneath an ancient tree. Miguel took her hand and, with a firm look, asked, "Are you still afraid?" Elena took a deep breath, looked up at the red sky, and replied, "No. Because now I know the value of every choice. And I know the cost of betraying yourself." The answer hung in the air like a liberating confession. And there, without grandiose promises, without expectations, the two simply remained. Together. Not as two trying to erase the past, but as two who had learned to live with it, and despite it. As the city lights began to come on, Elena felt that, for the first time in a long time, she no longer needed to run from the mirror. The woman she now saw reflected was whole. She carried scars, yes, but she also carried wisdom, strength, truth. And she finally allowed herself to move forward with ease. Without the weight of someone trying to rescue what was lost, but with the courage to build something new, with both feet planted firmly in the present. The past couldn't be erased. But it was no longer a prison. It was history. And, like every well-told story, it simply needed a dignified ending. And it was closer than she could have ever imagined. Winter arrived without warning, bringing with it a different silence. It was no longer the silence of regret or pain, but the kind that announces something has come to an end. The kind of ending that isn't shouted, that isn't written with exclamation points, but is accepted with a longer look at the sky, a deep breath, and the maturity of someone who has finally understood. Elena walked through the dry leaves with a book under her arm, her thoughts organized for the first time in many years. Her new job as a pedagogical coordinator demanded responsibility, but it also allowed her to look at the children and remember that everything begins there, in the small choices, in the repeated examples, in the truths spoken in whispers. As he crossed the school gates that freezing morning, he noticed how his body no longer carried the weight it once did. It was as if every part of him had undergone a healing process, not quick, but profound, and was now firmer, more whole. There was no longer any rush to fill the voids, no need to rescue what was lost. There was only a sincere desire to live well what was left of the journey. Miguel was still present, but what they had built ceased to be a romance and became a solid, almost fraternal friendship. Their reunion, though marked by affection, revealed that they had both gone their separate ways, and there was no resentment. There was only understanding. He returned to his environmental project, now in another part of the country, and she stayed. And staying, for Elena, was a choice. For the first time, she chose to stand on her own, without relying on anyone, without seeking salvation in another heart. Their last conversation was marked by a long embrace and a sincere smile. Miguel said he admired her strength, and she replied that she learned to be strong when she had nowhere left to run. They didn't cry. They knew that some people come into life to light paths, not to stay on them. And that was enough. Elena's book began to gain traction. Not because of fame, but because of identification. Women from different places wrote to tell their stories, finding in her narrative not only solace but also encouragement. And this impact led her to start a new project, conversation circles with women who, like her, had lost everything due to a bad choice, but still wanted to rebuild. The meetings took place in a small auditorium provided by a local school. Simple chairs, a table in the center, and words filled the empty spaces. Elena didn't present herself as a moral reference, nor as an example of overcoming obstacles. She simply told her truth. She exposed her flaws, accepted the consequences, and invited other women to do the same. It was real. And therefore, transformative. On the other side of life, Daniel also found his own version of peace. With the woman he'd chosen to start over with, he lived a calm, present love that didn't require constant testing. He had a serene routine, shared projects, and a newborn son who brought him a new understanding of time, care, and the love that is built with constancy, not fleeting intensity. He became a present, attentive father, someone who listened before acting and who loved without fear of abandonment. When he held his son in his arms, he vaguely remembered everything he'd experienced before, but not with pain. With learning. He knew that version of himself wouldn't have existed without his previous failures. He knew that every wrong choice someone made had led him to that right moment. And that was enough. A decade had passed since the night of the party. Enough time for wounds to become scars and for the story's characters to go their own ways. Elena still lived alone, but she was no longer lonely. She had close friends, projects that fulfilled her, and a sense of fulfillment that no relationship could replace. She never again became deeply involved with anyone, not out of fear, but because she discovered that not everyone needs a new love story to feel complete. She found meaning in her own journey, and that was enough. Sometimes, she remembered Daniel, yes. On birthdays, on significant dates, in old songs. But now the memory didn't hurt, didn't bleed. It simply appeared and left, like a gentle breeze that touches the face and continues on its way. They never saw each other again, nor exchanged messages. Her last living memory of him was the book she had kept so dearly and the knowledge that, despite everything, she had been forgiven. And this forgiveness, silent and definitive, was what gave her the freedom to rebuild herself. One day, during a lecture on education and rebuilding emotional bonds, Elena was approached by a young teacher at the end of the event. She held a copy of the book and said she had been cheated on 2 years earlier, that her husband had left her, and that she didn't know how to move on. She cried as she said she thought about giving up on everything, even herself. But when she read the book, she found something she hadn't expected, not consolation, but a mirror. You showed me that I, too, can rebuild myself, even after losing what I loved most, she said. Elena smiled, her eyes moist. She hugged the young woman and replied firmly, just because we destroyed something doesn't mean we can't learn to rebuild with more awareness. A mistake doesn't erase the value we can regain. As long as we face it head-on. That night, alone at home, Elena wrote her final blog post. It was a farewell text. It spoke of closure. Of cycles that close. Of loves that teach more in their absence than they did in their presence. It also spoke of forgiveness, not the kind that comes from the other, but the kind that arises when we finally accept ourselves as imperfect human beings, but constantly evolving. And it ended with a simple sentence: betrayal doesn't define who you are. But how you deal with its consequences, does. Life didn't offer cinematic endings. There were no dramatic reunions, no gestures of belated redemption. The story ended as the most impactful ones do, with each character in the place they chose or deserved to be. Daniel, happy in his new life, aware that walking away was his greatest act of self-love. Elena, transformed by pain and the courage to face it. Miguel, far away, but still part of building a new version of herself. And all the voices that crossed these paths, marked by a story that will not soon be forgotten. If you've made it this far, comment below what you thought of this story. Which character touched you the most? What decision would you have made differently? Your opinion is crucial for us to continue bringing you powerful stories like this. And of course, subscribe to the channel, because here you'll always find real, profound stories that touch us deeply. And before I close, here's a thought: betrayal doesn't just destroy a relationship. It destroys admiration, trust, respect, and most importantly, what took years to build, the emotional connection between two people who once chose each other. When someone betrays, they don't just break an external bond. They break, above all, their very identity. Because it's impossible to emerge unscathed from an act that wounds the soul of someone who trusted you. Betrayal leaves traces that time cannot erase. It only teaches us how to live with each other. Remember, this channel does not condone any kind of cheating. All stories told here are fictional, created to show how thoughtless actions can ruin homes, lives, and futures. Until the next story. May it serve as a mirror, a warning, and a cure for those who listen.